A knife on the table, a stranger's arm across his chest, and what she would do next would change his life forever. She had walked 40 miles through a January blizzard to find this dark Montana cabin, half frozen, hunted, with nowhere left to run. Her name was Naytay. She was Chiricahua Apache, and she was hunted by a mining company that believed she was their property to retrieve. His name was Wes Tanner. He was 26 years old, a line rider posted alone all winter in the crazy mountains of Montana Territory. More at home with horses than with people, with no company between November and spring but cattle and wind and silence. The cold brought her to his door in January of 1884. What he chose to do in the hours that followed would cost him his wages, his post, and the quiet existence he had spent years carefully building. And it would give him back something he had not known he was missing. Watch till the end. If this kind of story stays with you, like the video and subscribe. It means more than you know. Now, back to that frozen January night, and the moment everything changed. The line shack sat at the bottom of a long spruce draw, high enough on the eastern face of the crazy mountains that wind hit it from 3 sides in a hard blow. It was a 2-wall building, outer logs chinked with clay and horsehair, inner walls packed with old newspaper for insulation, just large enough for a man to stand upright in the center, sleep on a rope-strung bunk, and keep a Franklin stove burning without sweating through his long handles. A single window faced west, double-paned with oiled muslin because proper glass had never made the trip up the supply road. The horses wintered in a lean-to built against the north wall, out of the worst of the weather. The 2-bar outfit had posted west there at the start of November, same as the winter before. The work was simple, in theory. Ride the fence line every few days when the weather allowed. Break ice on the water troughs. Keep count of the cattle working the south exposure and ride down to report in the spring. In exchange, he drew wages, ate what he packed in, and was left entirely alone from the first hard freeze until the creeks ran clear again. He was 26 years old, and he had been comfortable with solitude longer than he had been comfortable with most other things. His father died of a throat abscess when Wes was 9. His mother followed 2 winters after that, influenza, a cold house, not enough wood stacked. He grew up in the bunkhouses of a half-dozen outfits across the Judith Basin and the Musselshell, learning horses before he could read well, learning how men kept themselves alive in cold country before he understood much about how they were supposed to behave in warm rooms around other people. He wasn't unfriendly, he just didn't need much from the world. The 2-bar's foreman, a thick-shouldered Scotsman named McCreary, pointed to him as the best winter man on the payroll and meant it as the highest possible compliment. You had to be a specific kind of person to spend 3 months in a 1-room shack without going strange in the head. Wes had done it twice already and was counting on a third to be the same. By early January, the snow had been on the ground for 6 weeks. The blizzard that hit on the 12th of the month was the worst he had seen in 3 years of high country work. It came out of the northwest in the late afternoon, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in 2 hours, and by full dark the wind was driving snow sideways through every gap in the chinking he had not caught. He spent that afternoon stuffing the worst cracks with strips from an old blanket he had been meaning to cut into rags anyway, and went to bed early. Stove loaded, the pipe damped down. His boots beside the bunk with the laces half-tied so he could pull them on fast if something went wrong in the lean-to. He slept the way a man sleeps when there is nobody to listen for but himself. Deep, dreamless. And then the cold stopped. He did not come awake all at once. He surfaced through sleep the way you surface through cold water, gradually, with a growing understanding that something had changed. The first thing he registered was warmth along his left side that had no right to be there. The second was weight against his back, weight that moved very faintly with the rhythm of breathing. His right hand went to the holster peg on the wall before his mind had finished forming the question. The pistol was still there. Not a threat then. Something else. His left hand, moving carefully under the blanket, found the edge of an arm that was not his own. He lay completely still for a long moment. The breathing at his back was shallow and uneven, the kind that comes from a body working too hard just to stay warm. Whoever this was had not come here to do him harm. They were barely keeping themselves together. Wes turned over slowly and sat up on the edge of the bunk. In the banked coal glow of the stove damper, he could make out a shape under his spare blanket. His spare blanket, which had been on the wall peg when he went to sleep. She had taken it without waking him. That single detail spoke to him before anything else about her did, whoever this was. She had been moving with deliberate care even while half dead with cold. She was young. The firelight caught the planes of her face, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark lashes against brown skin. Her hair was loose and wet with melted snow spread across the rough pillow. Her hands were tucked under her chin. On her left wrist, where the blanket had slipped, there was a wide scar, not a cut, but a rope burn, healed over, the kind that comes from being tied and pulling hard for a long time. He looked at that scar for a long moment. Then he rebuilt the fire. He did not deliberate over it. He put the wood in piece by piece and listened to the storm working at the roof while the room climbed back from freezing. By the time the stove was drawing well and the air had warmed to merely cool, she was moving. The small involuntary shifts of a body discovering it can feel its hands and feet again. She woke the way people wake when they have been deeply cold and deeply afraid. Slowly, then all at once. Her eyes opened and found him across the room, sitting in the chair by the stove, with a tin mug between both hands. He watched the quick calculation move through her face, where the door was, where the knife on the table was, whether she could stand on whatever her feet felt like right now. He set his mug on the floor and held up his open palms. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She did not move. No need to run. He nodded toward the window, where the wind still screamed against the oiled muslin. "You can't go back out in that anyway." She did not answer, but she did not move toward the door either. He rose slowly, went to the stove, and poured warm water into a second tin mug. He placed it on the edge of the bunk within her reach, then backed away and lowered himself into the chair again. She watched all of it happen. When he was settled, she reached for the mug. Her hands shook, getting it to her lips, but she held it there and drank. They sat like that for a while, the storm outside, the fire between them, two strangers deciding in silence what came next. He did not ask anything. She did not offer anything, but the quality of the silence between them changed as the fire built, tightened first, then very gradually eased. Her name, he would learn 3 days later, was Naytay. For the first 2 days, she barely spoke at all. She slept most of the time, the body's way of processing cold it had no business surviving. And when she was awake, she watched him with a watchfulness that was not quite fear and not quite trust, but something careful and deliberate positioned between the two. He did not try to close that distance. He did his usual work, fed the stove, kept water warm, mended a bridle he had been putting off since October. He made food and left some within her reach without making any ceremony of it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she rose on her own and built the fire back from coals before he was fully awake. He lay on his side and watched her moving in the firelight and understood that she had decided something overnight, even if he did not yet know what she had decided. She had the English more than she showed at first, the accent clipped and deliberate, the way a language sounds when someone has been made to learn it in conditions they would not have chosen. He learned to wait for it. Over those first days, the words came in pieces, and gradually the pieces became a shape he could hold. She had been taken in a government reservation sweep 18 months earlier, somewhere south of the Gila River country in Arizona Territory. A federal agent and a mining company man named Harlan Pike had reached a private arrangement between themselves. Apache women with no immediate family recorded on the agency rolls could be assigned as contract labor company operations around the territory. The word the paperwork used was placed, as if they were freight. She had been placed at the Silverbow mine camp east of Dillon in Montana Territory as laundry labor. He thought about that word, placed, for a long time. The camps used it because it carried none of the weight of what it actually described, placed. As if she were a book set on a shelf. As if the question of whether she had opinions about it was beside the point. She told him about the Silverbow on the fourth evening, sitting across the small table while he rewrapped the frostbite on her feet. She needed something to concentrate on besides the pain of circulation returning. The camp ran 3 shifts. The laundry crew worked 2 of them. There were other women at the camp, she started to say, then stopped, and he understood there were parts of the Silverbow she might never tell anyone, and he had no right to those parts regardless. What she gave him was the shape of the thing. She had been watching for a way out since October, studying the freight roads for when they opened and who traveled them, watching which guards went where in which weather, learning the rhythms of the camp, the way her people had always learned the rhythms of country they moved through. The camp ran on a logic she recognized from other kinds of places she had been made to inhabit. It assumed that the women inside it had nowhere to go and nothing worth going toward, that the cold alone and the distance alone would keep them there as surely as walls. The camp was wrong about both. When the January storm came in and the wind drove the temperature down hard, she walked out of the camp while the men were crowded into the mess tent to get out of it. She took a company coat off a peg near the door, not nearly enough protection against a January blizzard in Montana Territory, and a pair of boots 2 sizes too large, and she walked north. 40 miles, through a blizzard, on feet in the wrong boots. He pressed her on the direction. Why north? South was the reservation. East was Dillon and whatever law Harlan Pike had in his pocket there. West was more mountain than she could know in detail. North was nothing. High country, empty all winter, with line shacks posted every few miles for the winter riders. She met his eyes when he put that question to her. I knew this place was here. I have been watching the supply road since September. He sat back in his chair. She had not stumbled across his shack in a blizzard. She had aimed for it. While Harlan Pike's camp ran its 3 shifts and believed she was a piece of property waiting to be collected whenever convenient, she had been quietly and systematically memorizing every road and trail and supply route in the country surrounding that camp. Learning the land the way her people had always learned land, because your life, and the lives of the people with you, might one day depend on the accuracy of what you knew. He stopped thinking of her as someone things had happened to. He started thinking of her as someone who had been patiently waiting for the moment to make her own move. The blizzard did not break for 5 days, and when it did, a second system was already building to the northwest. So Wes stopped thinking about time and focused on what the day needed. He had grub for 6 weeks without strict rationing. He had enough wood. He had 1 bunk, 1 chair, 1 small table, and 2 people working around each other in a space built for one. She was on her feet by the 3rd day, the frostbite still wrapped but carrying her weight, and she started contributing in small ways she did not announce and did not wait for permission to begin. Banking the fire when it dropped, keeping the water barrel full from the drift packed against the eave, learning where he kept the flour and the salt without needing to be directed. He did not request any of it and did not make a point of noticing it. Both of them understood what was happening. On the 4th day she found the gap in the south wall chinking above the window frame that he had tried to fill properly 3 times and could not get to hold. She studied it for a few minutes, located his awl and a strip of leather from the repair kit, and packed the gap in a way that did not come loose. She did not mention it, and he did not mention it. He noticed that night when the draft across the floor did not come. On the 5th day, a pot of beans had been on the stove since mid-morning, and both of them were near it at different times, for different reasons. He to check the fire, she to top up the water, and somewhere in the late afternoon it became the 2 of them at the same time, standing in the small space between the stove and the table, her reaching for the wooden spoon and his hand already there. The moment, lasted about 2 seconds. She drew her hand back. He handed her the spoon without looking at her and moved to the chair. She stirred the beans. Neither of them said anything, but the silence after it was different, more certain somehow, as if both of them had taken a measurement of the distance between them and found it smaller than expected, and had decided separately that this was all right. He found himself thinking about that small exchange for the rest of the evening, not with any particular agenda, just turning it over the way you turn over a detail that tells you something true about a situation. She had come within reach without flinching. For a woman who had spent 18 months in a place where her proximity to men was never her own choice, that was not a small thing. He thought she probably knew he understood that. The not speaking of it felt like an agreement between them, careful and mutual, without either of them having to propose the terms. They talked more on the 4th and 5th days than across all of the first 3 combined. Not about anything large at first, the cautious, testing conversation of 2 people checking whether the ground between them will hold. She wanted to know what the crazy mountains were called before the survey crews arrived and put their own names on the map. He did not know. She told him the Crow had a name for them that meant the mountains that are different from all the others, which struck him as exactly right. They rose out of the plains like they had arrived from somewhere else, too jagged and too particular to belong to the usual arrangement of things. What he had thought was an unapproachable silence turned out to be something else entirely. She was not closed. She simply did not fill the air with words the way some people did, and she did not expect anyone else to. When she had something to say, she said it. The rest of the time she was present and paying attention, which was more than most company offered. There was an evening in the 2nd week when she sat across the table from him while he worked at resoling a bridle, and she worked on patching the company coat she had taken from the Silverbow. Canvas torn through at both elbows from crawling under a barbed wire fence the night she left the camp. He had handed her the sewing kit and an extra needle without making anything of it, and she had taken both without making anything of it either. They sat in that posture for a couple of hours, stove going, lamp between them, the storm doing its usual work outside the walls. He glanced up once at the coat. "Stitch holding?" She held up the elbow seam without stopping. It was tighter than the original. "A woman at the camp taught me that stitch," she said. A pause. Older woman, different band. She was quiet for a moment. She was still there when I left. He understood what was underneath the plain words. About what it meant to be the one who walked out. About who you left behind when you did. Did she want to go? Yes. Another pause. She had a small daughter. It was harder for her to leave. He went back to the bridle. After a while, he said, with the plain awkwardness he always carried when he tried to say things that mattered, that he was sorry about her people. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to respond. Then, which part? And there it was. The honest enormity of it in 2 words. As if the weight of the whole thing could be sorted into manageable portions. And as if he could point to one portion and apologize for it and have that mean something. It couldn't. He knew that, and she knew it, and she wasn't asking him to pretend otherwise. She was simply stating the truth. The thing was too large for any sentence to hold, and he respected her for that. The shack had a different quality in those weeks than in his previous winter postings. He had never been uncomfortable alone. He had spent too much time that way. But the silence when he was alone had been a specific kind of absence, a lack without a defined shape. Now the silence had her in it. The sounds she made moving around the room in the morning, the warmth of another body by the stove after dark, the particular way the cabin felt different on the one day she went outside to collect snow for the water barrel and left him alone in it for 20 minutes. And those 20 minutes felt wrong in a way the cabin had not felt wrong before she arrived. He did not examine that closely, but he noticed it. The days acquired a rhythm of their own. She learned his routines and fit her own work around them without waiting to be guided. He learned that she slept lightly and woke early, that she preferred working in quiet over working to conversation. that she had the habit of finishing a task completely and in good order before she moved to the next one, not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of practical good sense, the way someone thinks who has learned that small careless mistakes have large consequences in difficult country. He had always worked the same way. He had simply never shared a space with someone else who did. On the 9th day, a hard gust came through in the night and brought a ceiling panel down in the lean-to, and he spent the morning out in the cold reattaching it. When he came back inside, stiff-fingered and cold all the way through, she had a pot of broth on the stove and a piece of dry cloth warming on the rail above it, and she wrapped his hands without being asked, and did not make a production of doing it. And he sat at the table and let the warmth come back into his fingers, and did not think of anything in particular except that this was the most comfortable he had been in a lined shack in 3 years of winter work. She had a word she used for the mountain above them that was not an English word, and on the 10th evening he asked her what it meant. She looked at him for a moment to see if he was genuinely curious. He was. She told him it was from her mother's language and meant something close to the mountain that turns its back on the desert, which was a way of describing high country that kept its snow long into the season because it faced away from the southern heat. He turned that over in his mind for a while. "What's the word for this shack?" he asked. She looked around the room thoughtfully. "There isn't one exactly." A pause. "There is a word for a place where a person stops to wait out something dangerous. A shelter that is not meant to be permanent." "That fits," he said. She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. "I am not certain it still fits," she said. He didn't say anything to that, but something in him agreed. On the 12th night she had a bad dream. He woke to her moving sharply in the bunk. He had been sleeping on the floor by the door by then, giving her the bunk, which she had accepted without comment because it was the practical thing, and he heard her breathing hard and fast, and he stayed still and did not say anything, because he understood what it was, and understood she would not want him to make anything of it. In a minute or two the breathing evened out. In the morning she got up and built the fire, and neither of them mentioned it. But he thought about it through that day, about what it would take to sleep lightly enough to have bad dreams still coming for you, even after a week in a warm room with a fire and food, about what the Silverbow had been for her in a way she had not fully told him, and probably never would, and which he had no right to press. He thought about the scar on her wrist, rope burn, healed over but wide, the kind you get not from a single incident but from pulling against a restraint over a long period of time. Someone had tied her, she had fought it until the skin gave, and then presumably they had tied her again. He did not let himself dwell too long on the specifics, but he did not look away from the knowledge of it either, because it was part of who she was and what she had survived, and pretending it wasn't would be its own kind of insult. He thought about his own bad years, the winters after his mother died when he had been 12 and 13, and farmed out to whatever outfit would take a boy who could do chores, and how he had learned to sleep lightly during those years, never entirely sure what the next morning would bring. He had come out of that with the particular kind of independence that's really just the habit of needing very little from anyone. He recognized the same thing in her, the same careful self-containment, the same attention to what was hers to control and what wasn't. He thought it was probably not an accident that they could share one small room without it becoming difficult. 2 days after the dream, while they were both working at the table, her on the coat, him on the bridle, she mentioned that she had a younger sister. Not at the Silverbow. Somewhere in Arizona territory, on a reservation Naytay had not seen in a year and a half. It came out plainly, without preparation, as if the information had been sitting in her chest and had decided to come out when the moment was quiet enough. He looked up from the bridle. Was there a way to get word to her? She thought about that for a while. Church mission workers carried letters sometimes, slowly, when they got around to it. She had tried once from the camp, but any letter had to go through the camp's own postmaster, which meant it went through Harlan Pike's office, which meant it went nowhere. He filed that away. It was not something he could fix from a line shack in January, but it was something he could maybe fix later, when the roads opened, when the situation looked different. She did not ask him to. She was not asking anything of him. She was simply telling him the shape of her life, piece by piece, the way a person does when they have decided, carefully, with full awareness of the risk, to let someone else see it. She began teaching him things over those weeks. In the unhurried way she did everything. How to read a mountain snowpack for avalanche conditions, not by any formula but by the physical feel of the surface under your boots. The angle and aspect of the slope, the weight of recent snow against the settled layers below it. Her grandmother's people had moved through ranges like the crazies for generations before the armies and the government agents made that movement impossible. And they had moved through safely because they understood what mountains did and why they did it. She had that knowledge incompletely. She was young, not an elder, and a great deal had been lost in the years since, but she had enough. More than 3 winters of line riding had given him. He taught her things in return. How to read a cow's behavior for early sickness, how to judge the structural load of snow-covered timber, how to estimate distance in the thin air of high country where everything appears closer than it is. She listened to all of it with the same focused attention she brought to everything she encountered, asking precise questions when something was unclear and not asking questions when it was not. She taught him on one of those evenings the Chiricahua word for fire. He tried to reproduce it and failed twice and succeeded on the 3rd attempt, and she looked at him with a focused attention that might have been approval. Over the following days she added a word here and a word there when the moment felt right, the word for snow, for wind, for the particular stillness that preceded a change in weather. He learned them all carefully, the way he had learned the names of plants and weather signs as a younger man. Because useful knowledge was useful knowledge, and he was not too proud to learn it from whoever had it. In return, he taught her some things about the cattle. How to walk among them without triggering the particular nervous energy that meant a cold night was coming. How to tell from the behavior of a single cow at the water trough what the rest of the herd's condition probably was. She found this interesting in a practical way, not a sentimental one. And she filed it away with the same efficiency with which she filed everything she learned. In the evenings he found himself looking forward to the hour after supper when the stove was stoked for the night, and the lamp was lit, and they sat in the warm room together without needing to fill the air. He was 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, and had not felt lonely in those weeks. He had felt something close to the opposite, something he did not have a precise name for but recognized as important. On the 17th of January, the sky cleared after 6 days of weather, and the temperature climbed 4 degrees at midday. Not a true thaw. The ground was still locked, and the higher elevations would not budge for weeks, but enough to change the character of the mountain above them. The snowpack on the south-facing slopes shifted from powder to heavy wet, the spruce boughs releasing great sliding sheets of it throughout the afternoon. She stood at the west window for a long time that evening, watching the slope. He had been watching her watch it. She had been at that window every morning since she arrived, and he had assumed she was keeping an eye on the draw for riders. He was beginning to understand she had been doing something else. When he asked her what she saw, she turned from the window and explained it in the same careful way she explained everything. In a real thaw, she said, the melt comes through the Sutton draw first. The Sutton was the notch above them, a steep passage between 2 shoulders of the mountain, barely a game trail in summer and impassable in winter above the first quarter-mile, or nearly so. The lower section flooded before the trail above it softened enough for horses. A person on foot who knew the north face of the notch where the rock stayed dry even in melt could move around the water entirely. A horse could not follow that path. He had ridden past the Sutton 24 times in 3 years and understood it only as a place you did not take horses after mid-March. She had spent 3 weeks looking at it through one window and understood it as a drainage system with a specific vulnerability in it. If men came with horses, and if the lower section had flooded while the upper trail still looked passable. A trail laid up to the fork with the right signs in it could draw those men in. Boot prints in wet snow at the spacing of someone in a hurry. A scrap of cloth caught on a thorn bush at the place where a person fleeing would grab at something to keep their footing. Men who track for pay follow a trail when they find one. They do not generally stop to ask whether the trail was meant to be found. They would be stranded on the upper notch with horses that could neither advance nor retreat until the water dropped. Most of a day, sometimes two. He sat with all of that for a few minutes. The trail had to look unintentional. That was the genuinely hard part. The difference between someone who had thought about a problem and someone who had studied it from the ground up, detail by detail. Over weeks of watching, she had studied it. 3 or 4 more days of mild weather, he said. 3 or 4, she agreed. They put the trail in on the 23rd. She went on foot up to the fork in the Sutton, placing heel prints in wet snow at intervals that suggested urgency, catching a strip of faded canvas on a thorn bush at exactly the right spot, the place where someone fleeing would have grabbed for support on the slick surface. He followed at a distance and watched her work. She moved with unhurried precision, testing the surface before she committed her weight to it, choosing her angles with the same care she brought to everything. There was nothing theatrical in it. She wasn't performing urgency. She was constructing evidence that would, when read by trained eyes, produce the conclusion she wanted them to draw, and she was doing it from a deep, specific understanding of how that kind of reading worked, because she had spent her life in country where being misread could kill you. He understood, watching her, that the Silverbow camp had made a serious error. It had looked at a Chiricahua Apache woman and seen freight. It had kept her alive and sheltered and failed to ask itself the question that should have come with that. What does a person who has survived what she has survived spend her days thinking about? When the people around her have decided she isn't worth watching, they came back inside when it was done. She washed her hands in the water bucket and dried them on the rag over the stove rail, and he poured coffee. And they sat down on either side of the table without speaking, because there was nothing left to do and nothing useful to say. And both of them knew it. The trap was made. What happened next was up to Doss and the mountain and the weather. She knew precisely how to make a planned thing look accidental, and he did not interrupt her. Her boots were dry by the time they came back inside. Doss arrived on the 22nd, alone, before the trail was ready. He came up the draw from the south on a rough grella, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who has done this kind of work before, looking for something, not going somewhere. Wes had the 2 bars old sharps leaning by the door and was outside on the packed snow stoop when the man pulled up at the edge of the yard. Doss was perhaps 40, built square, wearing a buffalo coat and a low-crowned hat. His eyes did their own survey of the yard while the rest of his face stayed still. A runaway contract girl from the Silverbow camp, he said. His name was Doss, and he worked for Harlan Pike. Young Apache woman. Rope scar on her left wrist. Pike wanted her back. I'm the only one wintering this section. Wes kept his voice mild. Nobody's come through my yard since November. Doss looked at him for a moment with those flat, patient eyes. Then he tipped his hat and turned the grulla and rode back the way he had come, without hurrying, which was nearly worse than if he had argued. Inside, she was at the window. He could see from her face that she had heard most of it through the log wall. He will come back, she said. I know. She looked at the mountain. They put the trail in the next day. Doss returned on the 25th with 2 other men. One was young and pretending not to be nervous. The other was heavy-set and had the specific look of a man Pike employed to solve problems that had no polite solution. Wes was in the yard with the sharps. There were boot tracks going up to the Sutton draw, Doss said. Fresh ones. Elk. The young man said something about boot prints not looking like elk. Doss quieted him with one small gesture, the practiced economy of someone who had been in this situation before and understood that noise did not improve it. He wanted to look at the shack. "You're welcome to look at 2-bar property from out here," Wes said. "The shack is mine to manage until spring. If Pike has papers, he can bring them to McCreary when the road's open." A pause. "Or you can follow those tracks up to the Sutton while they're still showing. Conditions won't hold long." The 3 men exchanged a glance. The young one was already looking up at the mountain. Trackers did not like being told they were about to miss their window. They went up the draw. Wes went inside. She was at the window with her hands loose at her sides. The plan was in motion, and she had built it, and she knew exactly how it would go. But knowing did not stop a person from holding their breath. "Lower section was still rising this morning," he said. She nodded once, not looking away from the slope. He loaded the sharps and leaned it by the door, and the 2 of them waited. They came back down in the early afternoon. Doss first, mud caked on his coat to the knee, the grella blowing and high-stepping through the consolidated drifts, the other 2 behind him. They had hit the water in the lower section and come back around on foot by the north rock face, which had cost them most of 3 hours and whatever patience Doss had carried up the mountain. Wes was in the yard when they came out of the tree line. He had been watching the south draw for the better part of an hour. The mountain had the particular stillness it took on when something was moving through it that did not belong there. Not any sound he could name, just a change in the way the birds worked, the spruce below the tree line, a quality of attention in the air. He had the sharps, and he had put on both his coats, and his hands were warm inside his gloves. And he had been turning over in his mind every version of how this could go. Most of them ended the same way. Doss was a professional. Professional men hired to retrieve what their employer considered property did not give up clean when the property was 1 shack away and the only thing in the way was 1 line rider with an old rifle. They recalculated. They came back with more weight. She was inside. He had told her to stay at the window, and she had agreed, which meant she would be at the window watching the slope, with the same attention she had given it every morning for 3 weeks, reading what the mountains said about what was coming. Doss pulled up hard. He was past the flat professional patience now, and he let that be visible, which told Wes that the math had come out in one direction, and there was only 1 step left from here. He knew the girl was there, Doss said. Flat and certain. "Then you know something I don't. Don't be clever. Not being clever. Being accurate. Level voice. You've spent a hard day in this country, and you've got nothing to show for it. You could ride back to Pike and tell him the trail went cold, which is true. Come back in spring with whatever papers he has. Talk to McCreary. Do it through the proper channels." The pause was deliberate. "Or you could make this something it doesn't have to be." The heavy-set man's hand moved. Wes did not move at all. He looked at the man, steady and without hurry, until the hand came back. Doss looked at the cabin for a long time. He was running the arithmetic. How far this yard was from any law that would back him up. How much trouble this particular line rider was prepared to generate. What any of that added up to against whatever Pike was paying per day. "This isn't done." "Come back in spring with papers," Wes said. "McCreary's a fair man." Doss turned his horse. The other 2 followed. Wes stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded into the spruce, and then stood there a while longer listening to the mountain drip and settle in the thaw. He hadn't fired the sharps, had not needed to. He thought about what she had built in 3 weeks of watching out 1 window. The drainage geometry worked out by observation. The timing calibrated to the specific vulnerability of the Sutton draw. The trail made to look accidental down to the placement of 1 strip of canvas on a thorn bush. The kind of thinking that required you to treat a hard situation as a problem to solve, rather than a fate to endure, and to start solving it months before the solving would be needed. She had done the same thing at the Silverbow, watching and learning and waiting for the right moment to move. It was not luck that brought her 40 miles through a January blizzard to exactly the right place. It was the long, quiet, patient work of a mind that never stopped looking for the way out. He went and sighed. She was sitting on the bunk with her hands in her lap, in the focused stillness of someone who has just completed a very long and careful piece of work and is waiting for the result. "Gone," he said. She took a slow, full breath. "For the season." He leaned the sharps in the corner. Doss might come back in spring if Pike pushes him hard enough. But by spring the roads are open and the situation looks different. You'd have options you don't have now. She was quiet, thinking it through the way she thought everything, steadily, without rushing toward any conclusion. He found himself talking before he had fully decided to, about the northeast draw off the Sutton's north shoulder. Facing northeast, wetter in summer than the surrounding country, with the seep spring that ran cold and clean all year and good grass on the lower bench above it. The 2-bar never ran cattle that high. He had noticed the draw 2 winters back and had been thinking about it in the unfocused way you think about things you were not quite ready to decide about. He said he had been thinking about drawing his winter wages and not filing for next season's post. She looked at him with that level, measuring attention she had given everything from the beginning. The look he had understood by now was not suspicion, but the way she looked at things she was taking seriously. A homestead, he said. A cabin and a corral. Maybe a few head of his own stock in a year or two. He had been working for other men's outfits his whole working life. He didn't have to do that indefinitely. A silence settled between them. She was the one who broke it. That is something a man usually does alone. Usually, he agreed. I am not a woman who belongs to anyone. I know that. And I will not go to a place where I have no voice in what happens. I know that too. He looked at his hands, then back at her. I'm not setting terms. I'm saying the draw looks like a place. It would look better if you were in it. She turned to the window and held it with her eyes for a long while. Outside, the January light was draining out of the sky in the slow winter way, pale blue going darker, the ridgeline sharpening against the last of it. There are things my people do, she said at last. When 2 people choose to build a life together, the obligations go both ways. It is not something one person decides for both. That seems right to me. You don't know our ways. I'd want to learn them. Or learn what parts of them you want to keep. He was not good at this kind of talking and knew it, and he kept going anyway. I'm not trying to set any terms. I'm saying the draw looks like a place, and it would look better if you were in it. A long quiet held between them. The seep spring, she said finally. How deep does it run? Cold and clean all year, he told her. Deep enough. Then there would be good grass on the lower bench. She was thinking it through as she spoke. Good soil in the wet ground below it. We would need to work it before the first snow. She paused. That is late to be starting. Late, he agreed. Not too late. She turned from the window and looked at him directly, the same clear, unhurried taking of measures she had given him that first morning when she woke in his bunk to find him sitting across the room with open hands and a tin mug and no particular expression on his face. He still did not know exactly what she saw when she looked at him that way, only that it was different now than it had been at the beginning. All right, she said. He let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. They sat by the fire that evening in a quiet that was different from all the previous quiet. Not the quiet of 2 people being careful with each other, not the quiet of managing a difficult situation through deliberate behavior. The quiet of a decision that had been made and accepted and no longer needed to be revisited. The stove ticked and settled. Outside, the mountain dripped in the thaw. He drank his coffee and she sat with her feet toward the warmth, and neither of them needed anything else said that night. The rest of the winter passed in that register, which was a warmer and a more particular kind of quiet than any he had spent in a line shack before. The days were still cold and the work was still the same work, but something in the character of the time had changed. He noticed it in small things. The way he looked up from his work when she came in from outside, a reflex that had not existed before November. The way the lamp in the evening felt less like an instrument of utility and more like something you would want to keep burning a little longer than necessary. There were hard days, a second cold snap in February that drove the temperature to what felt like the bottom of the world. A scare when one of the 2-bar's cows broke through ice on a stock pond, and Wes spent 2 hours getting her out and nearly lost the tips of 3 fingers to the cold in the process. A week in late February when the grub ran low enough that they were eating beans and dried meat once a day, and nothing more. None of it broke what had been established between them. They were past the point where ordinary hardship could do that. She continued to teach him the country. The particular way the snowpack on a steep slope communicated its instability to anyone paying the right kind of attention, not with obvious signs, but with subtle ones. Variations in texture and density that meant the difference between a slope that would hold and one that would not. The plant signs that indicated a spring below the frozen ground. The way certain trees grew in response to the prevailing winter wind, and what their lean could tell you about conditions on the far side of a ridge you hadn't crossed yet. Her grandmother's people had survived in ranges like the Crazies by reading country at this level of detail, and some of that reading had come down to her through the women who had taught her before everything changed. He taught her things in return, though they felt smaller by comparison: how to judge the structural load of snow on timber before it gave way, how to read the condition of cattle at a distance, how the quality of ice on a stock pond changed as it moved from safe to dangerous. She paid the same quality of attention to all of it that she paid to everything, and she learned quickly. He drew his wages from the 2-bar in the second week of March, when the roads had softened enough to get a horse down to the main camp. McCreary gave him a long look when he said he was not filing for next season's post. A practical man, McCreary did not argue with decisions that had clearly already been made. He paid Wes what he was owed and shook his hand and did not ask questions. Wes rode back up the mountain. They broke camp in early April. He took what was his and left the rest in good order, the way he would want to find a lined shack if he arrived at one cold and in need. They moved north along the east face of the Crazies, following drainage lines she had mapped through 3 weeks of watching from one window, camping in snow that was going to slush on the south exposures, while the north faces still held their winter white. She led the route and he followed and learned the country through the way she moved through it, which was different from any way he had moved through country before. The northeast draw was everything he had remembered and better in the ways that mattered. The Seep Spring ran colder and cleaner and deeper than he'd expected. The bench above it was level and dry and caught the morning light until noon. The spruce on the upper slope were straight-grained and grew close together, the kind of timber that comes up solid without a great deal of extra work. She walked the site for a full morning before she said anything. Up the slope and down it, checking each exposure, reading where the drainage went and where it pooled, looking at the old grass and what it said about the soil below. He watched her do it and understood that she was reading the land the way the land wanted to be read, not the way a man with a deed and a survey line read it. "Here," she said finally, standing on the lower bench above the spring. The spring floods in a hard melt, but not this bench. Morning light until noon means the walls dry fast after rain. He had not known the flooding detail. She had read it in the deposit at the bench's lower edge, in the color of the soil, in the way the old grass lay. They started cutting timber the next morning. Building a cabin in empty country is mostly physical labor. The part that is not physical is judgment. Where to set the notch, what angle sheds water best at the saddle joints, how to calculate what a ridgepole must carry through 5 months of snow. She had the judgment on the aspects he lacked, and he had it on the aspects she lacked, and they traded knowledge the way they had been trading it since January, without ceremony and without keeping any kind of account. There was a morning in late April when they were setting the ridgepole and everything about it was going wrong. The log was a finger too large for the notch. The angle was off by enough to matter. and the wind was doing what April wind does in the high country, which is blow steadily from the worst possible direction for everything you are trying to accomplish. He was up on the wall plate, cold and frustrated, and she was below him holding the log steady with both hands and not saying anything. He came down and studied the notch for a while. "I need to take another inch off the east side," he said, more to himself than to her. She looked at the log and then at the notch. Without a word, she went to his tools and brought back the draw knife he had been meaning to use and had put down in favor of the axe. He took it and worked the notch for 20 minutes. When he fit the log again, it went in clean. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with that particular expression she had, the one that conveyed a great deal without conveying any specific thing, and he thought that if he spent the rest of his life working alongside someone who watched him with that kind of clear, unsentimental attention, he would probably do better work than he had ever managed before. The cabin went up through May. The door faced south and the window faced east toward the first light of the day. The corral took shape through June, post by post, using the split rails from the timber they had cleared for the cabin site. She shaped her rails in the style her grandmother had described to her, not the way he would have done it, but stronger at the stress points. And he paid attention and changed his approach for the last of the work. There was an afternoon in early June when the work stopped for a few hours because rain came through fast and hard off the mountain. The kind of summer rain that arrives without warning and makes everything too slick to work on safely. They took shelter under the unfinished roof and waited it out. The air smelled of wet spruce and turned earth. They were close together under the low frame because the finished section of the roof was still small. She was quiet for a while, watching the rain come down through the trees. Then she told him something about her grandmother, not the grandmother's name, which was a private thing, but that her grandmother had known a time when the Chiricahua moved freely through country very much like this, following the deer and the high summer grass and the clean water from the snowmelt, and that the mountains her grandmother had described to her as a child had looked a great deal like these ones. She said this not as a grief exactly, but as something she wanted him to know about where she came from and what this place meant to her, that she had not found a way to say directly before. He listened to all of it and did not say anything for a while after she had finished. Then he said that he thought her grandmother had been right about the country. It was good country. He was glad they were in it. She looked at him sidelong, in the way she sometimes did, and then the rain let up and they went back to work. She had a ceremony she wanted, the proper way among her people, for two people who had decided to build a life together. He told her he did not know it and wanted to learn what was his to learn. She spent 2 evenings explaining it, and he listened without interrupting, which was easier for him than it might have been for someone with more practice at sitting still and taking things in. On a clear morning in early July, on the slope above the draw where you could see 3 mountain ranges lying out in layers of blue shadow to the south, they made the promises they had already made in every other way except aloud. He cut the name into the door in August. Cedar, because the grain in it ran particularly well. Tanner, deep enough to last. She stood beside him and looked at it for a moment. "And my language," she said. "The name for a place is usually a description of what the place does." "What would it be?" he asked. "If you named it the old way?" She thought about it for a moment. "The place where clean water rises from the dark rock." A pause. "But that is too long for a door." He took out his knife and cut 2 more words below the first, smaller and going deeper into the grain. "Sea, lean, water." She put her hand flat against the door and held it there for a long moment, feeling the letters and the wood grain under her palm. Then she went inside to build the fire. By the time the first hard snow came to the northeast draw that October, there was a cabin with 2 names carved on the door, a corral holding 6 head of his own cattle, a root cellar built into the south wall in the style she had learned from her grandmother, and a smokehouse in the hillside that could carry 2 people through to spring. And there were 2 people in the cabin when the fire was lit. One had been alone long enough to have stopped expecting company. One had walked 40 miles through a January blizzard and broken into a stranger's dark shack and decided over the following weeks that it was worth staying for. The cold had brought her to his door, and everything that came after it had kept her there. They wintered in that draw for 31 years. The seep spring never ran dry. When they eventually built a second cabin, larger, with a proper glass window facing east, they moved the cedar plank to the lintel of the new door, and it stayed there for the rest of their lives. Tanner. Clan Water. Two names on one door. A life that started the night the cold was gone, and a man woke in the dark to find a stranger's arm across his chest and understood, before he understood anything else, that whatever this was, it was not something to be afraid of.